Okay, this time we're going to talk about dynamic tuning. Now, this is a fabulous feature that we're just in love with over here at Minionware. And what this does is it allows you to change your parameters based off of the size of the database. Now, for those of you that have seen me speak, you know I'm a really big proponent for backup tuning. And here, Minion Backup makes it so incredibly easy. So first of all, in order to do this, and this is a base level install, so this is what you're going to get by default. If we select from backup settings, you'll see here that we have a dynamic tuning flag right here, and it's set to 1 by default. So that means that we do have dynamic tuning turned on. Now, Minion.backup tuning thresholds is where the settings are kept. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. By now you should be familiar with our system of precedence, right? So this is our default row that's going to catch everything that doesn't have an exception. So here we have database name of Minion default, which has a backup type of all, so it's going to catch all of them. Now space type. This is an interesting column, because in order to grow and shrink your resources as the databases grow and shrink, you have to calculate the size. You have to know how big the database is. And we give you 3 different ways to calculate that size. You can do it based off of the data and index space, which is the truest way to find out, right? That's how much space you're actually taking up. And that's why it's the default. You can do it based just on the data. So instead of data and index, you would just have data in here. Or you could put file in here. I think it's file. Check the documentation for whether it's file or files. But you can say file, which really is how the help DB, and when you right click on a database here and say properties, and then you go down to right here, you say size. What this number is this is the number of this number adds together the data file and the log file size on disk. So on disk, both of my files are a little under 8.5 gigs, but you see here that I have 1.7 gigs free. So it's not really honest space. This is just the size of the files on disk. However, if you want to calculate it that way, you can. But just be aware, though, right, that you could have, 300 gigs worth of files and only 5 gigs of data in there. So you're gonna spin up a lot of resources for no reason whatsoever. But I at least give you the option to do it. So, but anyway, that's why we have data and index, because we add together the data space from the tables and the index space, and then that's how much data space is actually being taken up, and that's how big your data actually is. So the threshold measure in this case is going to be gigs. That's the only thing that it accepts right now is gigs. The threshold value, now for here it's 0, and this is an interesting thing because this is why it's for everybody. So what we're saying is this threshold value is the floor value. It's the bottom level value. So this is going to catch everything that is 0 gigs and above, right? So in other words, it's going to catch everything. So these are the default settings. So by default, we're going to use one file. We're gonna use the default number of buffers and the default number of max transfer size. Now these could also be null, and they would also default to, and they would also pick up nothing. Right now we're not going to use any compression whatsoever. We're not even going to define it. We're going to use default block size, begin time, end time, weekday. We're going to leave those alone for now. I'm going to have an advanced video next that shows you how to do some advanced configurations, and we're going to talk about that next, but it won't be in this video. And then whether or not it's active, you should be used to the is active flag by now, and a comment. And again, this can be for a number of reasons. You could put anything in here that you wanted to, but mainly it's there to both remind you why that config is there, and also to help to give you something to trigger to turn this on and off if you switch DR sites, or if you have a more advanced config. So Those are the basics of this table. Now let's take a look at what we're going to get here. Now again, we're going to specify backup statement get, and again, this is the statement. This is the SP that builds the statements for the routine. So you'll never call this on your own, other than to just test your config. So let's do a full instead of a log. So for Minion Dev, I've got a 1 gig database here. There we go, and I get my default settings, and you can see I get all of these things in here. I can see all of my settings, including my compression, my number of files, right? And there we go. So this will return 1 row for each file. So if I had 20 files in here, then it would give me 20 rows in here. So it's really easy to see what's going on, and then I can also see my path as well. So let's go ahead and play with this a little bit and see how we would do this. So let's say I want all of the databases on the entire server to use the exact same configuration. So I'm going to take right here, I'm going to right click, and I'm going to paste that, and then let's do a couple more just to have a nice complete setup there. There we go. I'm going to refresh that. There we go. So now I've got all rows for every one of these. Now I just need to change the threshold value. So let's say at 50 gigs, I want the database to use 4 files, and I want it to use a buffer count of 200, and we'll leave the max transfer size the way it is right now because you get the idea. Well, actually, you know what? This isn't going to be a valid max transfer size, but I'll show it to you just so that you can see. And this is row number 2, so I'll say max transfer size of 2s. This is just for testing, right? You'll want to use a valid max transfer size for this. You can see the documentation for those details. Compression, we definitely want compression turned on. We'll use the default block size as well, and we'll leave everything else alone. And is true, we definitely want, or is active, we definitely want set to true. And for the comment, let's see, we'll say 50 gigs. All, right? We'll just say all of them at 50 gigs. Fine. And now for this next one, oops, I made a mistake there, didn't I? There we go. Okay, for some reason it had everything zeroed out until I hit enter. Okay, so there's our 50 gig. And now we'll say at 100 gigs, I want to use, say, 10 files, and I want to use 500 buffers. And for this one, I'll do 3s. I still want to compress, and then here I'll say 100 gigs all. There we go. And now at 150 gigs, I want to use 15 files and 1,000 buffers, and I'll give this all 4s. Again, that's not a valid size. I'm just doing this to show you. And then I'll set that to 1. That is still true. And then I'll say 150 gigs all. And you see a pattern forming here, right? And we'll do, nope, that's the last one. Okay, so you see here that we have our different floors. Now what this means is this is going to catch all of them. This is going to catch every database over 50 gigs, right? That's between 50 and 100. So if it's 50 gigs and under 100 gigs, then it will catch this one. So you define the floor of each one of them, right? So this is the bare minimum that it'll take for this row to kick in. This is the minimum it'll take for this row to kick in. This is the minimum it'll take for this row to kick in. So for every 50 gigs that our database grows, then we'll use those parameters. Now anything over 150 gigs will still use this 15, right? It'll still use this value because this is the floor. This is 150 and above. And since there's nothing else after that, then that's the one it's going to use from there on out. So let's go ahead and test this. So let's look at a 50 gig. We expect 4 files and 200 buffers. So let's go ahead and pass this in. You see how we were able to test here. I'm going to call this 52. And you notice how I get 4 files. And if I come over here to buffers, I get my buffer count of 200 and my max transfer size of 22222. Right? There we go. That's my row. So for 100 gigs, You notice I get my 10 files. There's my 10 files, right? For 150 gigs, notice I get my 15 files, right? And my 1,000 buffers. Now for 500 gigs, oops, well, I could use 5,000 too, but we'll do 500 gigs. Notice I still get my 15. So that is my floor right there. If I wanted to add another row here, I could put another one for, say, 500 and above, and then use like 25 files or 30 files, and then 3,000 buffers, 5,000 buffers. That's an awful lot of buffers. I mean, that's, you know, you'd have to have a pretty big system to be able to withstand something like that. But I'm just making the point, because this solves a big problem that we have in backup today, and that's, in a large shop, you have to go through and manually tune every single one of these guys, right? You have to tune this database, and you have to tune that database, and then you have to tune that database. Well, I know a lot of shops that have thousands of databases. You can't do all this by hand. And what happens if a database, say you've got a warehouse or just a large OLTP database that gets up to 150 gigs plus, or 1.5 terabytes or 2 terabytes plus, right? And then you have a huge archival and you drop it back down, and say it drops back down to like 100 gigs or 50 gigs because you just have this huge archival. And now you're spinning up 5,000 buffers for a 50 gig database, right? So now you can see that as your database grows and shrinks through whatever method it's going to, then it's going to automatically pick up the settings that you told it to pick up, and it's going to use the appropriate setting for that. And you can set this across your entire environment. All you have to do is create these insert statements, and you can have a generalized tuning. You can have a generalized tuning method for your entire shop just by running insert statements on all your boxes, which is incredibly easy, right? So you can see that it's not only easy to configure, it's really easy to do a mass deployment. But of course it doesn't stop there, right? This is the default row. So this is what I want for all the databases. But let's say that this Minion Dev database right here is particularly sensitive, and it can't really take all of these buffers. So let's say it's 150 gigs, but it can't really take all of these buffers because it's on slower disks. So and it really affects production when we take these backups with, you know, 1,000 buffers and 15 files. So this one, I want to tune it, but it needs to be tuned down a little bit so that it doesn't take up quite so many resources. Well, what we do in that case, let's go ahead and right click and copy this guy, and then we're going to paste it here. And now we're going to enter in a row for Minion Dev. There we go. Now I'm actually going to enter in 2 rows, because remember from the other video on the paths table, the precedence says that once we're at the database context, we stay at the database context. So if I want all of the database, if I want all of the Minion Dev backups to use this one certain config, this one certain threshold config, then I will put all. If I only have one exception, say if I only have full, I'm only worried about the full backups, then I still have to have either a row for all. Let's go ahead and do that now because I want you to see it. Oops. So I'll copy and I'll paste. So now I either have to have a row for all to catch the ones that aren't fulls, right? Because if I say full and I leave it at that, then the log and the diffs won't have any config values. So if I have a full backup, it'll use this row, but the all row will pick up the diff and the logs, okay? So you always have to have this all value, this backup type of all here to catch anything else. If I don't have this all here, then I have to have another row here. I have to have 2 more rows here for log and diff, okay? Now let's go ahead and take a look at this. So I clearly, okay, so I'll stick at the 150. I'll only give one example right here, right, for 150. And let's say that we can only use 10 files is the most that we can capture, and we'll use, what's a buffer count we haven't used yet? Let's use 300 because we haven't used that for any of those. And for here we'll use 55555, right? And everything else will remain true, except here I'll say 150 gig minion dev full, right? So now I'm giving myself a note there as to what that's for, just a little summary. And again, that gives me a good way to turn these on and off. If I set my comments properly, I can just search for anything that, you know, star minion dev star, right? So for minion dev, whereas before, you notice how we were using these 15 files for minion dev at 500 gigs. Now at 150 gigs and above, I don't want to go over 10 files and 300 buffers. Let's see how we do. So there's my 10 files, and then there's my 300 buffers. So there's my exception for that backup type. Now, for the ones that don't get caught, let's go ahead and set one for 3 files and a buffer count of 15. I'm just giving you something that'd be really easy. Notice how this transfer size matches the row number right here. I put all 6s in there because I'm testing my config. I'm making sure that it's doing what I want it to do before I move on. And then I can come back here and set these transfer sizes again. So the minion dev full is going to use the 10 files, but all of the other minion dev backups are going to use 3. So if I come here and I'm running my full again, you see here I've still got my 10, but let's do a diff. And I've got my 3 files and my 15 buffers. And the same thing for the log right here. I've got my 3 and my 3. Now, the one thing I don't have here, and this is really important, you notice how, and this is going to complete your config, right? You notice how I have a threshold value here for 0 for minion default. But what I don't have is a threshold 0 for minion dev, because remember, once we're at the database level, we never go back. So I have a catch-all here for the backup type, but I also have to have a catch-all for the threshold value, and it has to be set at 0. If you don't, then any databases, anytime minion dev goes under this 150, it won't have any config values. Now there's an exception to that, and we'll talk about that in a second. But for right now, let's say that every time you have a named database, and I'm going to copy this one again, and I'm going to paste it right there. I'm going to say all, and I'm going to say 0. So whatever I want the small ones to be, anything that doesn't have an exception. So this is the all row for 150 gigs and above. And this row catches everything from 0 to 150 gigs. Okay? If you don't have that row, you'll fall into what we call the failsafe. This is the only value that has a failsafe because it's so important. If you do not have this row in here, then it will default back to this row. But this is the only table that it does that for. And this is only because this config can be a little bit confusing. It's really not once you get the hang of it, but it's easy to misconfigure, especially in the beginning. So we have a failsafe that if you forget to put this row in here, then it will fall back to the minion default 0 row. That's what we call that, the 0 row. This is the 50 row. This is the minion dev 150 row, right? So this is the minion dev 0 row. So I'm going to state this for you again, just so that there are no mistakes. Every time you have a database exception, and that's what this is a named database exception, you have to have a 0 row, right? You have to have an all 0. Put it in there. Once you get that in there, then you can put in all of your other exceptions for full, for all, for logs, for diffs. You can do all of that stuff, but always start right here with an all and 0 row for every database. So if I had 30 databases on my server and I wanted them all to have separate configs, the one thing that I would have in here is 30 databases with an all and 0 row, and then whatever other configs that I needed them to have. Do not skip this all 0 row for your databases. Like I said, the failsafe will kick in if it has to but it's always best to have this row in here because it's a lot more clear, and we're not guaranteed to carry the failsafe going forward. The next release we may decide that it's not necessary and we may get rid of it. So it's always a good idea to explicitly define this row. And again, with the is active, you can have different configs even for the server it's on. So let's say that you have a mirroring partner that isn't as powerful as the primary, and you don't want to back up those databases with as much gusto as you do on the primary, right? Well, then you can easily turn those off. Again, you can have that pre-task, right, or that pre-step that determines which server you're on, and if it's on that, and if you're failed over and it's on that other server, on that secondary server, then you can use the comments section. If you've made your comments, if you've made your comments good, if you've made them well, anyway, if you've got good comments, then you could do something like, you could put something in here instead of 150 all. Let's say that this is the DR site, right? And this is the DR site. And you would turn these guys off. There we go. So now these guys are turned off, and that pre-task would come in here and say, oh, I'm on this server, turn set is active equal to false where comment does not equal DR site, and then set is active equal to true where it equals DR site. And so you can see that it's turning those on and off depending on the server that it's on. So there's a lot of power in here. And there's even more power when we get into these advanced configs right here in the next video. That's what we're going to do next. If you've liked what you've seen so far, join us in the next video, and I think you're really going to like it.